back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina Zuckerman, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. With us today, we have Zainab Khan. She is the president and founder of the Muslim American Leadership Alliance, known as MALA. Zainab, welcome to the show. Before we get into a topic for which you have the perfect background as both an active member of the Muslim American community and a psychotherapist, tell us a little bit about yourself, how you started Mala, and how this combination of being a nonprofit founder, but also someone with a background in psychology, what drew you, and how does that work?
Irina, thank you so much for having me on your program this evening. I've been in admiration of your work and your courage for many, many years. And obviously, I think, for people to know, in regards to this topic with the Israel-Hamas war and anti-Semitism, that we'll be discussing with, from the angle that I'm kind of seeing everything as, I think it's important for people to also know that for many years, we collaborated and we did some incredible community heritage and arts programs and interfaith events as well. And a lot of this kind of is interestingly coming back full circle and seeing the space and how much a different narrative is needed and what we have to do to actually address interfaith relations. So my background, my professional background, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. I'm also a visual artist, and I started in this nonprofit space kind of in a way of out of trying to build something that was representative of people that like myself and that I knew. So we started Mala back in 2015. It was a group of like-minded Muslim Americans that were trying to find a platform where we could share our individual stories, but also not fall into the monolith of victimhood narrative of how Muslim Americans were represented. Everything was either very overly theological or political or very heavily leaning on a victimhood or grievance narrative. And we started Mala as a platform for storytelling. So we started with being the first organization to archive the oral histories of Muslim Americans, which are now housed in the National Library of Congress. And in doing so, when we did this, we saw a huge need for community programming for Muslim Americans. So in Chicago, in New York, in Washington, D.C., and other small cities, we really started collecting stories and then also building programs and events around these stories and the unique leadership in the Muslim American community. And kind of fast forwarding to where we're at in the here and now, after October 7th happened, I found myself going through my Rolodex of 10 years of partners, organizations, institutions, individuals, whatever I could to kind of put together a statement of solidarity with the Jewish and Israeli community, because this was so important to show that, we condemn acts of barbaric terror, that we stand with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And I found myself struggling to find any organization or institutional support that was Muslim or of Muslim heritage to sign on for this. And this led me to penning an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal about the issue of anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. And so hence here we are with this conversation. So that was kind of the introduction that was pretty long. But what I'm also seeing a lot right now is just my basic textbook, grad school, things that I read about conformity and social psychology and just social norms and groupthink and group impact. And I'm actually living it and seeing it. So I will say that this has kind of been a very rattling and traumatic and tragic time for myself, as well as I kind of look through and try to build out a different landscape. There's many Muslim Americans similar to myself that have these very similar sentiments. We're very appalled by the hate. We're shocked at the level of anti-Semitism that the community is displaying. We want to do something about it. And what it boils down to is the lack of institutional support that I'm seeing the lack of institutional support and representation in the Muslim American community. So kind of that was a very long intro, and as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this topic, and I have a lot to say. So
Oh, I'm so glad because because I certainly have a lot of questions to ask. But let's break all of this down into pieces of a puzzle, because all of this, I'm seeing pieces here and there, but everything doesn't quite add up. And I kind of want to go beyond the different partisan, attacks at each other, and kind of try to figure out what exactly, how we came to this place to begin with. I mean, before the Israel-Hamas war and before the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel, I mean, there have been other issues, there have been other concerns, there have been, on the one hand, efforts to build Muslim-Jewish relations and and interfaith relations between all major religions and things like that. And then there was also concerns about kind of political Islam, the politicization of religious institutions. But overall, nobody was really all that focused on this domestic scene and what that meant. All of a sudden, we are seeing these institutions become very, very active, more so than ever before, and they seem to be speaking for everybody. And I know that you've previously have expressed concerns about the fact that these fairly narrow institutions seem to have the biggest platforms to speak for the Muslim American communities. How did it come to pass that these guys that are, a couple of major organizations that seem to be recycling people and may not really have all that much representation, how did they get that much funding, that much legitimacy, that much support to be really speaking on behalf of very diverse Muslim communities in the US?
yeah, that's a really complex question that actually kind of predates me. Mala was started in 2015, but even before then, I knew that other Muslim organizations, even for example, like ISNA, ICNA, theological organizations, CARE, MPAC, all of these, they just were not representative of the people that I knew, of the Muslim Americans that I was connected with. And I am very much active in the community. I'm not I'm not putting it where everybody's own spiritual way and being is different, but I I identify very strongly with being Muslim. That was, this is my culture, this is my religion, this is how I am. And when it comes to the Muslim American representation, I can honestly say where I saw a huge issue was that if we did speak out about issues that were pertaining to us, like women's rights, women's issues, honor violence, I saw that I was very quickly gaslit, right? And then it was like, you're being Islamophobic if you're bringing up these topics. Well, then, that's really concerning, because these were issues that were happening even in America. That's actually how I started in this space, is that I was counseling survivors of domestic violence, and the majority of them were of, Muslim or Arabic or South Asian background. And it was simply because of my name. There weren't that many counselors or therapists at that time, when I was still kind of undergoing, my work and starting in that space. It was very isolating. And so in that struggle, I saw that, anybody who kind of spoke out against these issues, they were immediately ostracized or labeled as being Islamophobic. And this was like very, very terrible, because some of these really major issues when it came to women's rights and women's issues that were with the diaspora Muslim community, they were just really being minimized simply by that label of being Islamophobic. So that's where I see a lot of the problem lying right now. Now, if you, even voice concern or support, like even if you say, I'm standing up against anti-Semitism, or I'm standing up against, the atrocious barbaric sexual acts of violence that were committed by Hamas against Israeli women and children, all of a sudden that's looked at as a signal for supporting bombing in Gaza. I mean, this kind of conflation has always been, very troublesome, in my opinion. And now it's right here at the forefront, where we don't have a place to actually voice and say, we really condemn and stand against these atrocious acts of violence. The issue of extremism and indoctrinating children from a very young age is creating intergenerational hate. What are we doing about this? What can we do to stop this? And instead, I'm seeing, mosques and community centers, and look, all of it's on social media. They're just blatantly posting it up. Martyrdom is being supported. This is shocking to me as an American, that I'm seeing this happen here in our own country.
So what exactly has happened? There is a cross section of the population that seems to have much in common with political Islam followers. That cross section consists of formerly fringe right-wing voices who believe that Islam is actually best represented by Islamists. They seem to be in agreement with the Islamists on that subject, which I find highly ironic, because quite frankly, if you are against that sort of extremism, then you should not be empowering such voices. But be it as it may, they seem to believe that these organizations represent the true face of Islam as it was historically, and so forth. And quite frankly, it is astonishing that on the one hand, they seem to detest these people and see them as a threat, but on the other hand, there has been no effort to really displace the organizations that actually speak in that tone, and to either self-empower or externally empower voices who are not concerned with this sort of political culture. So how do we even come to understand those voices in the Muslim American community who are not involved in these political issues and who do not wish to
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I think for a very long time, and to even now, Islamists were given really, responsible seats at the table. Just recently, CARE was asked to, be present. It was perhaps just a couple months prior to the October 7th events, but they were asked to sit in a White House meeting on anti-Semitism. I mean, you have the most anti-Semitic organization sitting, right, and their only purpose that was to sit in there was to change the working definition of what anti-Semitism is. This is appalling. And I can say that we can start by stopping them, stop giving them a seat at the table. I mean, that's where it begins. That's how you legitimize a group, a narrative, a consensus is, we have to start with that.
So, to my understanding, Muslim Americans in the US come from very different backgrounds. They come from Arab countries, from Southeast Asia, from African countries. They're local Muslims who've been here for generations. They're converts who've converted, from African American communities who do not come traditionally from Muslim Brotherhood, Muslim from Islam, but who've converted either to Islam or to sort of Islamist, sort of kind of semi-religious movements. And you have also other groups from literally everywhere, and they come from different cultures, they come from different traditions, histories. Some are more recent than others, and they come from different schools of thought as well. And how does this issue of different cultural heritage and different religious traditions intersect with this political kind of perception of these communities as monolith?
No, that's a great question. Look, Irina, the majority of Muslim Americans are not Arab. They're also, we have to differentiate the Palestinian issue with the Muslim American identity. And unfortunately, always conflated. It's a virtue signaling that if you are Muslim, you have to stand for XYZ. And in this case, it's you have to stand for the Palestinian liberation. Look, I am very sympathetic to the plight of the Palestinians. I've come across so many, Palestinian women, because I'm very involved with women's rights circles and women's issues. But Palestinian women that were like, these protests and this far left rhetoric is actually drowning out the voices of actual Palestinian American diaspora that do want change, that do want to, live a life of liberty from Hamas, from extremism. They don't want suicide bombings. They don't want, this kind of extremism and terrorism to be like, re-recycled in every single generation, but their voices are not being heard. And so it's through different initiatives, through women's networks, through small campaigns that we're trying to organize and bring together like-minded voices. But the big problem, I think, is that there's not institutional Muslim American support. We're not organized. We're not a theological organization, so this also comes into responsibility with clergy, right? So I'm not finding an imam to relate with. So I'm going to find a rabbi. I'm going to find a pastor. I'm going to find a reverend. I'm going to find anyone that is within my community that stands up against this form of hate, this kind of rhetoric that is labeling people, especially Jewish Americans, as genocide perpetrators or warmongers. And then saying it's not the Jewish people or Judaism that we're against, it's Zionism, right? This is where it's that pink elephant in the room. Well, anti-Zionism basically means that you are supporting, the elimination of the Jewish people and their right to Israel. I mean, this is where it all boils down to. And I saw a very heavy anti-Semitic connotation in so many interfaith events that I had been a part of, especially when it came to Muslim-Jewish relations. There was always a caveat when it came to Muslim organizations participating with Jewish organizations, right? And it was always, well, it's about the occupation, or this is about the oppression of the people. And it's like, we never were able to, aside from Mala, at least from what I see, is that we were never able to really look at the shared heritage, the culture, peace building, dialogue, rejecting extremism, moving forwards, building a new collective community for our children, for the next generation. None of this was being done. And I'm sorry, that means that there has to be an entire new landscape created of what interfaith intolerance really looks like in America.
It seems to me that previous models of interfaith dialogue and even Abraham Accords affiliated, efforts, they failed completely, because despite all this positive publicity about the need to work together and overcome political issues and previous paradigms and things that failed, as soon the moment something big happened, all of that went down the drain immediately. All this rhetoric about tolerance and so forth has disappeared, and it's like almost a switch was switched on. And my question is, why was it that all these efforts to try to kind of overcome the perceptions related to terrorism and the Israel-Palestinian relations and the importance to Muslim identities and so forth, why is it that what was wrong with the previous way of thinking that it so quickly dissipated the moment a challenge came up?
Well, because there were always caveats and conditions imposed when it came to interfaith. It was always about, yes, we support Jewish people. We are not against Jewish people. It's Zionism that we're against. And that was always that undertone that was present with these kinds of events and programs. I quite frankly never came across one where it was Muslims that were supporting Israel's right to exist, the Jewish people's persecution from Muslim lands. Never came across that really until like our organization really supported it. Wasn't really seeing that across the board. And this kind of comes back in the wave of where we're on now. This had consequences. Having this kind of underlying hate and rhetoric and agenda, it really was counter-effective, right? Because now here we are completely divided, and we're back worse than we started, in my opinion.
So this is where we get into this issue of conformity. Given the monopoly that CARE and its ilk have over the discourse on various issues that they claim to be directly related to Muslim American identity, whether they are or they aren't is a separate issue, but that they claim. What are the challenges for unaffiliated Muslim Americans, or those who do not necessarily, who disagree with these organizations? Are they facing some sort of a retaliation from these organizations if they choose to go against the mainstreaming of such narratives?
That's a really that's a really excellent question, Irina. And I think a lot of what we're seeing right now is we're seeing social control, right? So there's really three types of conformity, where we're seeing compliance, identification, and then internalization. And right now, what we're seeing is that there's going to be ostracizing if you go against this narrative of being Muslim and being American and having to, call for ceasefire, having to call for, the end to the Israeli occupation. Look, none of us here are celebrating, children dying. War is a terrible thing. But when it comes to us as leadership, what are we doing to extend the olive branch? What are we doing to actually set an example and say, you know what, we stand up against extremism? October 7th happened because there was a horrific ideology of Islamist ideology of extremism and hate, and this is being committed in our name under our religion, and people are chanting, Allahu Akbar, which is terrible. It hurts my heart when I hear that. It's just such a horrendous thing. Why are we not, as Muslims, speaking out about that? Right? We have to lead by example. But this goes against the status quo. So social collective punishment is really the key. Look, I know what it's like to be cast as a pariah. I've been doing it since 2012. It's not a fun feeling, and it's not, and it's the vitriol it's horrific. But it's a vortex, right? And then it dies out. And now all of a sudden, every single now it's pushed let's look at the issue of women's rights and women's issues, for example, right? Almost like 15 years ago, I would say, to talk about the issue of honor-based violence, it was taboo to bring it up. We couldn't talk about FGM or honor violence, or the issue of, parents killing their young girls because they're becoming too westernized. That was Islamophobic. Now, since the narrative has shifted a bit more, I think, to the social norms of what's, acceptable to be digested more on the left, then you can, now you can openly talk about it and condemn it. Why did it take so long? This is what we're seeing again. Now it's, yes, we do condemn Hamas, but it's Zionism, it's the genocide, it's the oppression, it's the occupation. Well, how long are we going to rehash and regurgitate that? Does that really help us in the here and now? Does that really help our communities and where we're looking in the past? And everybody's theological interpretation is going to be different. Everybody's historical context is going to be different. I'm not going to get into that. Those are not my domains. But where I can comment and where I can say is that it's deeply problematic, and there's a deep social conformity and bullying that's happening, and labeling and doxing and all sorts of that nastiness that comes with it. And social media, it just makes it helps it flow along even more. this is where we're at. This is where the problem is. And I do think it comes back down to the established Muslim American institutions, even if they're not Islamist, right? And even if they're a community center or a mosque or a nonprofit, whatever it is, take the courage to speak up and stand out against this. You have to do that. I'm encouraging you. To do that because there are other Muslims that are waiting. And if you have leadership, use your privilege. Use it wisely. Don't fall into that vortex. Don't fall into that group conformity that because we're Muslim Americans, we have to have this angle. No, we're Americans first. We are Americans first. We live in a shared community. We live in this country. We have our neighborhood. We have our communities. I live in the South. I found it where at least it was not as charged to reach out to some of the interfaith communities when it comes to Muslims and Jews. Maybe it's because I'm not in a big city where a very charged rhetoric is dominating our existence. We're about our daily lives, and this is about brotherhood and sisterhood and companionship and showing that we're Americans and we need to come together rather than divide ourselves.
This begs the question, what kind of tools are needed to provide young Muslims or anybody who is on their own, who are not in a place of affiliation with these major organizations, who wants to pursue a different path, who doesn't want to be conform, who sees him or herself as more, independent minded. How can such people be reached? How can they be helped, and by whom?
I think right now that's a question that I'm trying to figure out as well. Social media, unfortunately, is the louder and the more vicious and the more abhorrent you are in your language, the more you're going to move. I want whoever is listening, I want them to understand, after World War II, the entire world of social psychology, it shifted because and a number all the leaders of the social psychology movement, actually majority of them were Jewish, and it was because they were looking at how did people conform during World War II and commit such atrocities such as the Holocaust, right? What gives us that, what makes us commit such horrible acts? And right now what I'm seeing is kind of the same exact thing of Solomon Ash's study, Stanley Milgram's study. We're seeing that people conform to the group norm, and that's social. That's the social message that's sent out of what's acceptable. And for Muslim Americans, and this is a very, very ugly pill to swallow, but are we just kind of going along with the status quo of what's expected with us? Nobody likes to know or come to a conclusion that they're wrong, right? It's a very deep soul searching kind of a thing. And it's not a pleasant experience to be like, hey, I really messed up here. But I'm seeing that. I'm seeing people who after October 7th were putting up just vile messaging and now slowly removing them from their news feed, from their timeline. And it's the damage was already done. It was already done. And you can't, and I think this had really, really, really major repercussions, I think, especially for the Muslim American community, because we have to change our leadership, the way that we respond. Why was it so difficult to condemn and to say this was a heinous act of terrorism, that 1,500 Israelis were brutally slaughtered? And instead, when Sheryl Sandberg even posted a video on it, I want everybody to go on her post and read the comments and what people are saying and who they're coming from. And that'll give you an idea of what I'm seeing as well and what I'm dealing with when it comes to organizing Muslim American community, asking, where's the proof that Hamas raped? Where's the proof? This is propaganda. putting up posters of hostages has become propaganda. I wanna really let that sink in. When did we come to this point in our society where putting up posters of a 10-month-old baby or a 4-year-old, how is that propaganda? And these are the same people that are saying we stand for humanity. We stand for human lives. Well, where was your humanity in this?
There's a difference between people who stay silent, who don't do anything or don't say anything as a sense of maybe diffusion of responsibility. Maybe they think somebody else will do it so they don't have to, because they don't want to draw attention to themselves, because they feel social pressure. And then people who go out of their way to kind of virtue signal where they are, that may have long-term consequences even for themselves, because a few years down the road it may cost them their career, it may cost them a social position, because they've openly supported extremism, they've openly supported terrorism, even if they didn't necessarily think it through. So where is that urge to kind of go out of your way to actually say something or get involved comes from? One thing again is to say silent, not exactly profiles and courage, but this issue of conformity you spoke to makes it understandable. But the other issue is actually people acting and actually supplementing and enhancing and echoing these voices and giving them actually bigger uh bigger sphere of influence. How where is that coming from? Who is it they're trying to impress exactly, and why do they feel they need to say anything if they're going to speak on this topic instead of just saying silent and not getting involved?
I definitely think it's an identity issue, or if you're coming from a place of Muslim background or Middle Eastern, or whatever it may be, you have to say something. The whole I've seen a whole bunch of this also. There, look, so if you go on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, people's pages, I saw doctors, physicians, lawyers, professors post some of the most vile anti-Semitic memes, and then again take them down. Issue a half 20% apology, very much so, because they're in fear of losing their jobs or whatnot. And then of course you have the ones that will just completely slander you. You're a Zionist, you're warmonger, you're a genocide supporter. And look, for too long that label has been thrown in such a apples to versus oranges way. It doesn't even stick its relevancy anymore, because the bottom line is that there was a horrific terrorist attack. It continues. We're seeing with these protests. From the beginning, I had said these protests are inciting violence, and they did. People died. There was so much bullying and people from the far left to the far right have created this vortex of this hateful rhetoric, and everything is hostile. I can't even voice my support for anything, because it's just it's such a hostile environment, and this is what we're dealing with, and it's shameful. It's very shameful. It's embarrassing. I don't have the answer of why. Number of factors: conformity, groupthink, mob mentality, people that are uneducated, that don't know history. Majority of them are very young. They're in their 20s, they don't know history, they're denying the Holocaust. I've even seen people, I have screenshotted, I should show you my screenshot folders. I mean, have them alphabetized. That's how organized they are. But really, where I actually saw people that came to Mala events and came and ate our food and mingled and were very much a part of promoting their Muslim American identity. But then on forums or on posts, they'll actually saw exaggeration.
You froze up.
There's Israel is all colonizers. It's all there's the Jews are not a minority. I mean, just the most hateful comments that you can see that are so dangerous. They're so dangerous in our society, and made me realize, wow, you know what? If this is it, if these are the people that have showed their colors, then I don't want them to be a part of this organization. I'm not going to represent them. You can see where the door is. Walk out. So I'm not going to pander to that or appease to that. What I do see now is a different landscape, a yellow brick road that has not yet been laid out, and very well can be a positive way of rebuilding and restructuring what Muslim American leadership looks like, what interfaith leadership looks like, what a pragmatic and nuanced way of conversation and dialogue can look like. All of this has to be redefined. And you know what? I'd rather have it that way than to have a way that's built around facades.
Speaking of facades, now, as you mentioned, now that the masks are off, a lot has been said about how are non-Muslims and Muslims going to get along after all this, how Jews and Muslims are going to get along after all this. I think the much bigger, much more basic, and much more immediate question is, how are Muslims and Muslims going to get along? How is this community, path going to move forward given this divide, this internal polarization over these issues, the fact that there are some forces trying to drive community to hatred or bully or push and put that sort of social pressure? How is that going to get worked out from within?
I think it's going to be very complicated, but then again, it may not be so complicated because if the institutional support and representation, right, Mala is still fairly small in the sense where we're a nonprofit. We're not, run by the State Department. We don't have like a big clout in terms of like media presence, or we have impactful programming. We have thoughtful programming. We have really solid leadership. But maybe perhaps it's an eyebrow raise towards who does have influence and how they're using it and how they're using their privilege and how they're using their leadership and what kind of message they're giving. And I think Muslim Americans, don't be afraid to speak out when you hear this kind of hatred. Don't be afraid to say, you know what, this is not representative of me. This is hateful. Hate in any forms, and I acknowledge this. There was a horrific stabbing of a Palestinian boy in Chicago, a 6-year-old boy by, it was a hate crime. There were 3 young Palestinian college students that were shot. I know it's still under investigation of motive, but still it's a horrific thing. And I personally know that there is vile, vicious hatred towards Muslim Americans, right? But it's, at what point is it where is this what's defining our identity right now? I don't think so. I think that where we're at right now is we're in a unique position to take leadership and ownership and set a new course that is pluralistic, that engages, that doesn't have the same old rhetoric of being under siege, of grievances that are inherited from, previous leadership, previous generations. It's not ours to carry anymore. We look forwards. I look forwards. My dad came from Afghanistan. He fled extremism. He knew what this was about back in 1957. He came to America. And so, that was even before the Soviets came. That was before before all of this, but the inkling was already there, right? Of how society was. You have to look forwards. You have to move forwards. If we're rehashing and regurgitating history lessons that are, taught biasly, like taught out of bias, taught out of hate, taught out of anger, how are we ever going to move towards peace or reconciliation or moving forwards without carrying this kind of hate in us? And this kind of hate, Irina, I saw this very, very much so openly in the interfaith community, and nobody ever said anything.
This also leads to a question about the new leadership. How do we move past these ossified organizations and people who've incorrectly called themselves leaders and who've been acknowledged as such by the wider community, in the political spheres and social spheres, and who are completely failing their demographics, completely failing at what they're doing? How do we push back at them when they're, quite frankly, very well funded? That's the basic question.
Look, I think you bring up a great question again. Look who's elected into Congress, right? You only have what, 2 or 3 Muslim Americans, and 2 of them take the cake for being the most hateful, vicious, appalling, shameful, disgraceful elected congresswomen. And they're both far left. And perhaps, Muslim Americans can organize and gather and, have, the beauty of America is freedom of political thought. Let's have some Muslim American Republicans run for office. Let's see, let's shift it back to the center right. Let's bring something that's not in the far left and the far right. We can have something that's centered, but does a Muslim American always have to be a Democrat? I mean, that's another thing that we have to look at too. Not that I'm connected with, not that I know. There's many Muslim American Republicans, and perhaps that there is time for one of us to run for office, and that way we can have a little bit more even-handed representation. I think that's going to come from the moving middle, this quiet majority that's in the middle that is really desperately trying to seek a platform of representation and still hasn't found it, and they deserve it.
I found it quite amusing that some of the political Islamic movements in the US have ended up being split over the issue of woke education and woke politics in schools. And on the one hand, they have become natural fellow travelers with the radical left. On the other hand, no matter what they try to do in public, ideologically they're simply quite conservative. Socially,
it's the most fascinating thing. The most socially liberal Muslim Americans that I know, they're supportive of LGBTQ rights, of women's rights. They're they'll go to the local church, they'll go to the synagogues, they'll go everywhere. They're the majority of them are Republicans. And it's like where are we on this spectrum? Because I feel like what's happened is that the Muslim American identity has become hostage to polarized politics, and who we have elected is like really far left, raging, ragingly hateful towards America, that type of personalities that got elected. And then they take the whole entire space and circle, saying we're representative of the Muslim American community. No, you're not.
Well, quite frankly, the people who promote them are also doing a huge disservice to Muslim American communities, as far as I see. I think people, who are tired.
But they're not in the service to service. Just keep that in mind too. They're not in the service to service. That's a facade. There really is. They're not in that, because real, true pluralism, tolerance, and democracy is exchanging ideas. Someone can be listening to this and, I'm sure there's some things that I said that could agree with, and there's some that you could debate and disagree with, and there's some that I really am not an expert in and really can't comment other than on a surface level. I own that and I accept that. But I think that, that's what, and that's the kind of leadership that I think is really sorely missing in Muslim American politics. I think so far every single candidate or one, it's like the far left, and that becomes that back to what our topic is, like group conformity, group norms, it's bullying. And then if you are a Republican Muslim American, then you're, anti-immigrant, you're a warmonger, you're this, you're that, and every label gets thrown at you. And it's like, are we really at that point now where we're going to pull each other down because we don't have freedom of political view? I mean, so many of us come from that background, right? Where, if you look at each one of the groups, like Syrians who went through a horrific civil war and, were killed by their own people from Yemen, people from Egypt, Iran, it's like Pakistan, all these places where oppression and intolerance was the reason why they fled their home countries and then come here only to just kind of relive that back up again. It's traumatizing.
All of this brings me to the question of how, of some of the tools that they used to keep all these people hostage to these, kind of, to this politics. One of them is, is fear. One of the issues that I wanted to mention is it's quite controversial and it's understandably sensitive, but this whole thing of tying anti-Semitism to Islamophobia. On the one hand, it's quite natural to be concerned that when you have a huge political issue and controversy, there's going to be bias and bigotry coming out from people. On the other hand, is the data on the actual level, rise in Islamophobia sentiments in terms of polling, in terms of people being questioned? How accurate is it? I am not controlled by the organizations that have a vested interest in that. And second, what is the data on the rise of Islamophobic incidents that are directly, actual hate crimes or hate, bigotry or discrimination related crimes?
Well, I can say this. I don't know how the reporting is recorded, how the data is collected, but I will say, as a Muslim American, I didn't experience protests and chants that were asking for my extermination. That's a big difference. We've seen group hordes, thousands, tens of thousands upon thousands, people, the Nazi flag at the Rockefeller Center, the Christmas tree lighting. You Google the images, you see it, the Star of David with blood all over it, and some of the most horrific signs and chants. Muslim Americans didn't go through that, where they had organized protests against their existence. Let's just keep it that way. We didn't have organized protests against our existence, did we? I want people to think about that.
My concern that the people who are trying to create this narrative with Islamophobia are less concerned with protecting people from getting harmed and more concerned with having them distance themselves from outside, from having them integrate less, from having them be afraid of what might happen to them if they take, or because of their identity. And they use this sentiment to divide and to actually isolate Muslim Americans. And I'm not sure how to overcome that without coming across as unsympathetic or someone who is not, not. Oh, there you go. You're back.
I apologize about that. I'm joining on my phone now. There must be something wrong with my connection
Yeah, it
here.
happens. Yeah, so what I was saying is my concern is that um the people who try to kind of push the Islamophobia narrative are doing so not out of concern about protecting their communities, but out of desire to kind of fear monger and cause Muslim Americans to be isolated and to self-isolate and to perceive outsiders as a way, that they are more hateful than they actually are. So how do we, and unfortunately a lot of the politicians are going along with it by creating this equivalency between anti-Semitism and the especially the rise in anti-Semitic incidents past after October 7th and Islamophobia. So how do we make sure that on the one hand we don't tolerate bigotry, we don't tolerate hate, but on the other hand we don't exaggerate and overstate situation that is not as dire as people would like make it out to be in order out of some
Right.
of political correctness and actually create a bigger problem.
Yeah. And I think that's what is kind of happening with the Islamophobia narrative. Look, there's bigotry towards any group that's going to hate Jews are going to hate Muslims, right? That's kind of let's kind of like look at it like hate in any form is condemned, right? But what kind of hate is actually going on, and what kind of intimidation, threats, hate crimes are actually being perpetrated out of the motive, right? The motive. And I think that I'm not a civil rights lawyer. I'm not a polar, like I don't, that's not within my reach. I know that the FBI rated or recently stated that there's been a rise in over 62% of hate crimes towards Jewish Americans since October 7th. Now, anti-Muslim bigotry is like, I think, put on there, like there's rhetoric and content that's being shared, but not like acts of violence. So yeah, those two are separate. But it's not to say that there needs to be a hard pause. Let's not politicize hate in the way either. And I think that what I see is that with a lot of these Muslim, like Islamist organizations, they politicize hate, and then it becomes really difficult because hate in any forms, in all forms, should be condemned. But if we're looking at it from a very narrow lens of what really is and what isn't, it becomes very complicated. And I think that's where fear mongering comes in, and showing I mean, I really can't answer your question, Irina, because I don't know as much on it. I can only um say that it's what I see is I'm seeing a lot more hatred towards Jewish Americans and Jewish American groups that I'm seeing from this end of, like, as a Muslim American.
Finally, I'd like to kind of end on a more hopeful note. Given the lessons that we've learned about what has and hasn't worked in the past, given this framework of conformity, of this bullying, of this push, and given the need to redefine, the path forward in different terms and try different things, how do you see that happening? What do you see is the new start? How do you see it actually picking up? How do we rebuild on the basis of kind of reality and not wishful thinking, not facades, and not self-serving kind of fundraising oriented initiatives?
Yeah, I think we have to move. We have to voice ourselves. We have to be out there. Right now, it's every single type of grassroots type of connection. I think that's where it's going to have to start. I think that This is a huge wake-up call, of who's allowed to have a seat at the table when it comes to issues of tolerance and pluralism and interfaith. Let's really look at what's happening. Why was one of the most anti-Semitic organizations allowed into a White House summit for to discuss anti-Semitism? I mean, that to me is just the most counterproductive um, way to go about this. There is support, I would say support voices that are speaking out. It's an ugly landscape, Irina. It really is. I see a lot of charlatans. I see a lot of opportunists also, and it's exhausting. It's a very, very draining space right now. But I do think that if the groundwork has been kind of leveled, which it has, we can start, and it might be slow, but we can start. We can start by building a different narrative, such as this conversation that you and I are having. We can start by showing actual real solidarity with the Jewish and Muslim communities and the Christian communities. I mean, this is important for all of us as Americans. We can look at redefining what being an American diaspora, from a diaspora group looks like, and reinstilling the values of American pride and pluralism and tolerance rather than divisive hate. I mean, too much. At what point are we going to say enough is enough? I've said it. Enough is enough. And if you're going to bring hate, then I'll show you the door. But
the other issue pointing that you mentioned, the charlatans, the frauds, and opportunists, I think part of the reason why there's so many is this because the incentive structure is flawed. Right now there's an incentive for outside communities, Jewish, Christian, and so on, and to invite kind of anyone who's willing to speak to them. But maybe the point is to invite people who are speaking to their own communities first, who are already doing their work on their own to their own communities, and who have demonstrated a record of actually being an ambassadors to their community in their own language. I don't mean foreign languages, but literally in the language of their community, in the way, because right now there is this, I sense this desperation to have quote unquote good Muslims, which in my opinion is quite smacks of bigotry in itself, who are willing to go to this Jewish event or to a Christian event and to say good things about Jews or Christians and coexistence or Israel or whatever. But maybe we don't need that. Maybe what we need is people who are doing education on the ground, who are teaching things to young children in their own communities, who are bringing things into their communities and not the other way around. I mean, it has to, these partnerships have to work both ways, and I haven't seen enough of that.
It can't be tokenism, and it can't be out of opportunistic exploitation of another group's suffering. I mean, this is what I've seen constantly. I've seen it a lot. I really, and this is where it does become really hard, because when you are doing that kind of grassroots type of work and yearning for representation and yearning for a platform to show, all the different, a different narrative and a different approach in leadership, you're up against, for not just your counter, whatever you want to call it, opponents, or your counter view, counter mission, but you have to work within some of the issues of people within your own space of taking the spotlight. I see it as wherever I can be helpful and needful in this conversation, I will come in. I do think that this was needed, and this is really, really much coming from a place of genuine concern. It's very hard for me, because I have a 5-year-old son, and then I think about where is he going to be? Who's going to represent him? What kind of clubs or groups is he going to have? He's Persian. He's Persian heritage. Where is he going to go in all of this? Where do my husband and I, both of who come from Muslim heritage, like where are we where are we going? Where are we represented? It's coming from a place of very deep concern. It's coming from a place of seeing betrayal. People, like I said, that I had mentioned earlier in our segment, that came to our events, ate with us, broke bread with us, came to interfaith iftars, Seder dinners, and then all of a sudden, posted this. It's so painful. I'm going to remain optimistic, and motivated and determined to carve out, even if it's a smaller path or a smaller way of doing something, but the right way.
I think so. I think focusing on concrete results, even if they're small, step by step, I think it's better than just having a lot of highfalutin rhetoric that doesn't ultimately accomplish anything except photo ops and superficial issues that ultimately fall down the minute there is a challenge. There is a need for resilience building. That's for sure. Resilient institutions, resilient mindsets, resilient communities that can stand up to challenges and stand up to bullying and figure
Yeah.
out a way to move forward and to excise these characters who are, quite frankly, bringing problems into their communities as much as to the outside. So
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I am so happy to have discussions like this that give me hope for the future.
Likewise, Irina, thank you so much for including my voice. It means a lot. And thank you for all the courageous work that you do for truth and for freedom and for human rights. You really are about humanity, and it's a nasty landscape out there, and you have shown your courage and your will, and that's tremendous.
Thank you so much, and I hope to be hearing a lot more from you, and I'm sure only great things
Yeah.
are ahead. And for everyone who's been watching us, of course, this was Zainab Khan. She's the founder and the president of Muslim American Leadership Alliance. Please check out their website, check out their wonderful programs that are picking up again, and they're doing lots of great things. And I'm sure we'll be having many more discussions in the future, hopefully much more optimistic ones, under much
Yeah.
happier circumstances. And for everyone who's
Amen.
been watching it, this was the Washington Outsider Report on Coalition Radio. Please tune in next Tuesday night at 9 p.m. as usual for our next program. And thank you for watching. Have a great night.